Well, thank you for having me. It's a real privilege and honor to be talking to alumni. I, of course, graduated, actually, maybe many of you don't know this, but I graduated from the college back in back in those glory days, the days where things where people wrote 120-page theses, and they shouldn't have, but we did anyway. And so I've been around at the college. I was thinking about this just the other day, that I think this is my 18th year teaching, I believe. And I have taught gastronomy for over a decade. And so what I wanted to do tonight in sort of laying out for you the content of this evening for my talk, I wanted to talk about the foundations of my class, gastronomy. As I started teaching gastronomy many years ago, I did it because I was interested in seeing if I could do a class about food. And as it turned out, there was an awful lot about food. It was an interest of mine, but I thought I would just teach a class and it would be an interesting elective and I might move on from that to do other things. I have, since that time, offered the class again and again and again, and the ideas that undergird the class have become really something that is formative to my own personal life, to my teaching at NSA, both in Lordship when I taught that for many years, and also to my ministry at Trinity. This class has had a surprising impact upon me. And so it's also been an interesting class that over the years people have told me how much the class was impactful to their life. I've had people tell me that gastronomy changed their life. And that surprised me at first, but as I have thought about the class and thought about what we study and what really animates the spirit of the class, I thought what I would like to do tonight is see if I can tell you why I think gastronomy is not just an important class about something like food, because I think that you might say, well, this is a liberal arts college, Mr. Appel, what on earth? I think some of my fellow professors, when they see people walking around with food, have thought, man, you have a really sweet gig teaching a class about food, right? You get to eat a lot of food, it's a great time. Is this really a class? I want to say it's not only a class, but I think it's a class that is really important and central to the mission of the college, which is to create young men and women who rise up to be makers and shapers of culture. So what I want to try to do is talk about the philosophy of why I think this is significant, why it's timely, and why it's incredibly important for us to understand and embody in our own lives. So yes, I have titled my talk this evening, Fight Like an Amateur, Affirmation as Cultural Warfare. I think as we go along, you will understand what this has to do with gastronomy and why it's so significant. I'd like to begin with a quote from Chesterton. Chesterton said, "The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him." It's a really important quote. And the more I've thought about it, I realize this is really what gastronomy is all about. It's devoted to the idea that a soldier fights because he loves what is behind him. I also think that this orientation that Chesterton is talking about in this quote is harder and harder for our culture to understand. What do I mean by that? I simply mean that Chesterton is, of course, saying that love is more powerful motivator than hate. Yes, anyone who's Augustinian would know that's true. But he's also saying something more too. There are ultimate commitments involved in either posture. The posture that fights out of hatred and the posture that fights because it loves and wants to interpose yourself between the enemy and the thing that's loved. Think for a moment about all the outrage that we've seen in cancel culture over the past several years. That embodies, I think, one dimension of this perspective. And the outrage of cancel culture is really interesting, I think, because it makes everything a personal insult, and there is no argument to be had. If you know anything about cancel culture, you know this is central to the idea. There's no discussion. But why is there no discussion? Well, the idea that the reason why there's no discussion is because there's nothing to discuss. There are no reasons. Fundamentally, the philosophy of cancel culture is built upon a view of the world that says that world does not have meaning in and of itself. Meaning is subjective, it's imposed on the world, and therefore it's my meaning versus your meaning. And the only way we can settle that is by duking it out. And if it's not my meaning, you're a threat to me, and I'm interested in suppressing you, putting you down, destroying you even. But I'm not interested in having a conversation with you. Think about the difference between that perspective and something like courage. What is courage? Is courage the absence of fear? No, not at all. Courage is strength in the presence of fear. It's strength in the presence of fear because something good is threatened. In other words, courage as a virtue makes no sense without something to defend, without something to protect, something that you love. Courage is motivated by love, a love greater than fear, that conquers fear because of the thing that is threatened. And I think this interesting challenge is mirrored in education. Universities have largely given up the pursuit of integrated knowledge built around an understanding that there is unity to the world, and they've been focused instead on a kind of pluralistic utilitarianism, a perspective that embraces radical diversity. And this means that education is increasingly about the pursuit of unconstrained desire, the imposition of desire on the world to achieve the ends that I want, rather than the discipline of desire toward the goal of the good. And this has been accompanied by a shift in what it means to be fulfilled as a human being. Carl Trueman illustrates this change wonderfully in his recent essay, The Rise of the Psychological Man, and I quote, "I recall once being asked by my grandfather, a lifelong sheet metal worker in a Birmingham factory, if he had found satisfaction in his work. His answer was that he did indeed find his work satisfying because it enabled him to put food on his family's table and shoes on his children's feet. This response is striking precisely because it is so outwardly directed. Any feelings of satisfaction he had were the result of actions he did for others. Ask me the same question, and my answer would be that I find my work satisfying because I enjoy teaching. It makes me feel good to stand in front of a class and talk about interesting ideas. To be colloquial, it gives me a buzz. The difference is clear. My notion of satisfaction is an inward-directed one. Less to do with my impact on others, and more to do with my own immediate feelings." I think that we're raising a generation of young people who have lost the ability to know the meaning of their actions apart from personal gratification. They don't understand what their actions mean apart from the satisfaction of their own desire. Expressive individualism sees meaning not in what is or what ought to be, but only in what I want something to be. Only what I want something to be. That's where meaning alone is found. If we want to raise up a genuinely countercultural men and women who both know what is and what must be done, who are both wise and courageous, we must begin by understanding the power of delight, that is, love rooted in affirmation, in the joy of the good of God's creation. That's where we have to begin. And that's what gastronomy is chiefly devoted to as a class. So here are some lessons along these lines from gastronomy. Let me begin by saying that delight is essentially and outward action because it is an act of affirmation. Delight is an outward action because it is an act of affirmation. To affirm, literally the word means to strengthen or to confirm a thing. It is to say yes to its being. That's what affirmation is. It's saying yes to someone's being, to a thing's being. It's being delighted with something or with someone, with God and His perfections, His supreme goodness. A Renoir, a vase of flowers, a 2005 Bordeaux, a Bach fugue, or a bowl of gumbo. Properly understood, delight is a response to the worth or the goodness of the beloved. It's directed outward, and it's a response to the being of the beloved. In his wonderful book, The Supper of the Lamb, how many of you have ever read The Supper of the Lamb? All right, good. When I go around and ask that question, there are not many people who raise their hand, and you all are, I see alumni. I've had my influence on you. You've read it. Good. But let me remind you of something from it. He gives us our first clue when he states his qualifications for writing the cookbook. First, he says, I am an amateur. If that strikes you as disappointing, consider how much in error you are and how entirely the error is of your own devising. At its root lies an objection to cookbooks written by non-professionals. It does not, however, apply here. Amateur and non-professional are not synonyms. The world may or may not need another cookbook, but it needs all the lovers, the amateurs, it can get. It is a gorgeous old place, full of clownish graces and beautiful drolleries. It has enough textures, tastes, and smells to keep us intrigued for more time than we have. Unfortunately, however, our response to its loveliness is not always delight. It is far more than it should be, boredom. And that is not only odd, it is tragic, for boredom is not neutral. It is the fertilizing principle of unloveliness. In such a situation, the amateur, the lover, the man who thinks heedlessness a sin and boredom a heresy, is just the man you need. More than that, whether you think you need him or not, he is a man who is bound by his love to speak. If he loves wisdom or the arts, so much the better for him and for all of us. But if he only loves the way meat browns or onions peel, if he delights simply in the curds of his cheese or the color of his wine, he is, by every one of those enthusiasms, commanded to speak. A silent lover is one who doesn't know his job. Capon notes that we often use the word amateur for a person who is not very competent at something. So we think about someone who is amateurish, not very competent. But its original sense comes from the Latin amator, love. It means love. Amateurs do what they do for the love of the thing, not for the gain that they receive for pursuing it. So we have historically distinguished between the amateur in say for instance in amateur sports, non-professional sports, and the professional, someone who does it for the love of the thing versus being paid for what they do. In this sense, the amateur is the one who responds to the world with love. This, of course, implies that the world is worthy of love. To be an amateur, then, is to affirm that the world is good and worthy of affection. And Capon says that this love of what is good compels the amateur to act and to speak. It's love that drives him. And so he studies, and he ponders, and he speaks, and he acts because he loves. Love compels action. In sum, an amateur is someone who loves the world, listen, for what it is. That's going to be very important. He loves the world for what it is. And this is why Father Capon begins the Supper of the Lamb, you may remember, by encouraging a long session with an onion. You remember that? Take an onion and sit down and spend an hour or longer with the onion getting to know it. And of course, in that chapter, he rhapsodizes about just how odd and wonderful onions are. Their beautiful shape, the fact that they are almost translucent, made mostly of water, the fact that they are layered and they can peel open. Whenever I've asked my students, why does Father Capon spend a chapter extolling a confrontation with an onion? Almost always, they tell me, it's because onions are so amazing. Well, they've learned the lesson with the onion, for sure, but that's not the reason why Capon talks about taking an onion and sitting down with it, onion across from man. This is the reason why, he says. Man's real work is to look at the things of the world and to love them for what they are. That is, after all, what God does. And man was not made in God's image for nothing. And this leads him to conclude that particular chapter with one sentence set off from the rest of the chapter. I think it's the key to the entire book, and it's the one that everybody misses. He says, one real thing is closer to God than all the diagrams of the world. One real thing is closer to God than all the diagrams of the world. So what's the alternative? What does he mean by diagramming? What's this diagram business? What does it mean? Well, he says, listen to what he says. Every time man diagrams something instead of looking at it, every time he regards not what a thing is, but what it can be made to mean to him, every time he substitutes a conceit for a fact, he gets grease all over the kitchen of the world. Reality slips away from him, and he is left with the oldest monstrosity in the world, an idol. Things must be met for themselves, Capon says. To take them for their meaning is to convert them into gods, and to make them too important, and therefore to make them unimportant altogether. Idolatry has two faults. First, it is not only a slur on the one true God, it is also an insult to true things. I think this is one of Capon's most profound insights in the book. Idolatry is not just not giving God his place, dishonoring him, worshiping the creature in the place of the Creator. But what Capon notes is that every time we do this, every time we don't receive what something is as his creature, what God made it to be, but what we make it into, every time we do that, we not only dishonor God, but we dishonor the thing itself. We dishonor creation. When Israel made the golden calves, there was nothing wrong with making a golden statue. It was, after all, a cow out of gold. But when Israel said, "This is the God that delivered you out of Egypt," not only was it a dishonor to the God who had delivered them out of Egypt, but it was an insult to cows. Cows are not gods. They're cows. And they must be honored and known for what God made them to be. And that's one of the great perils of idolatry. It always leads to the destruction of the thing worshipped in God's place. Idolatry, then, is the imposition of meaning. What a thing can be made to mean to me. And this is the tragic legacy of both modernity and postmodernity. Meaning is not something given. It is something made by us. We're the ones who impart meaning on the world. Meaning comes from human nature, if we can even say that humans have a nature, not from God. And here is the point. It is therefore imposed and not received. Do you understand that? It's imposed. It's not received. Nietzsche was willing to take this to its logical conclusion. Because there is no God, meaning, indeed goodness as an objective reality, does not exist. Only the imposed desires of the individual. Michel Foucault, a follower of Nietzsche in postmodern categories, said, "This is why knowledge is power. Anybody who claims to know anything is making a claim about power. Wherever you see laws or people claiming to know the truth, what they're doing is trying to control you, because there's no truth to be known. There's only the imposition of desire on the world." We can contrast these two ways, the way of Capon and the way of Nietzsche or Foucault, this way. The biblical view is that things are precious before they are contributory. They're precious before they're contributory. They have meaning before they're useful to us. And they're useful precisely because God makes them meaningful. The modern view is things are precious if they are contributory. And I'm the one who decides how and when and if they contribute at all. The price of this freedom, of untethering the world and creation from the one who made it and from his purposes for it, is the loss of the capacity for joy. Joy isn't the simple feeling like happiness. Joy has reasons. It is a response to God's goodness in creation. In the biblical categories, that's what joy always is. Joy is a response to the way things are. And therefore, Paul can say, rejoice always. Even when the circumstances are not good, even when you're in prison, you can still rejoice because things are still good because God made them so and no one can change it. Joy has reasons, and they're rooted in the good of what God has made. Nietzsche even understood this well. And let me give you a quote from him. I love this. I really love Nietzsche, by the way, because Nietzsche takes his atheism like Lewis liked his whiskey, straight. There's no fudging around. He really understood the implications. And this quote is no different. Listen. If it be granted that we say yea, and this is a capital yea, yea. If we say yea to a single moment, if we affirm a single moment, then in so doing, we have said yea, not only to ourselves, but to all of existence. To have joy in anything, Nietzsche said, one must approve of everything. So you can see why the thorough-growing disapproval of Nietzsche for everything was so important. He understood that if you let joy in even a little bit, crack the door to the goodness of creation, and that it has purposes and meaning. If you say yea to one single moment of your life, in that sense, you have to affirm all of it. That's how important it is. And this is why Joseph Pieper says that the festival spirit, the joyful, rejoicing festival spirit, quote, in its essential core is nothing but the living out of this affirmation. To celebrate a festival means to live out for some special occasion and in some uncommon manner the universal assent to the world as a whole. That's what a festival is. It's a specific celebration of a universal reality, that the world is good and it has meaning. And so we rejoice and we sing and we dance and we make piles of food and we celebrate. Joseph Pieper, in his wonderful little book, In Tune with the World, which is where that quote came from. If you haven't read In Tune with the World, you cannot, even after graduating, fill up your NSA education by continuing on and reading that wonderful little book. It's extraordinary. In the book, though, he contrasts the difference this affirmation makes, or he explains the difference this makes by contrasting the Christian martyr on the one hand with the secular naysayer on the other. This is a wonderful quote, and its reasoning is tight. So I'm going to ask for you to pay special attention to listening to it. Listen to how Pieper explains this. Listen to the contrast. Such affirmation, that remember, joy in creation, is not won by deliberately shutting one's eyes to the horrors in this world. Rather, it proves its seriousness by its confrontation with historical evil. The quality of this assent is such that we must attribute it even to the martyrs, at the very moment, perhaps, that they perish under brutal assault. A theologian commenting upon the apocalypse has said, "That which distinguishes the Christian martyr is that he never utters a word against God's creation. In spite of everything, he finds the things that are very good. And therefore, in spite of everything, he remains capable of joy, even so far as it concerns of him, of festivity." A martyr, on the worst day of his life, still has the capacity for joy and Pieper says, even festivity, because he knows, as he walks to his death, that the ground that he treads upon, even his own persecutors, made in the image of God, that goodness still is in the world. No man can subvert that. And so he never speaks, even in his dying moment. He gives thanks and he rejoices. He never speaks a word against God's creation. That marks the Christian martyr. But listen, on the other hand, to how he contrasts the secular naysayer. Whereas, on the other hand, whoever refuses assent to reality as a whole, no matter how well off he may be, is by that fact incapacitated for either joy or festivity. Festivity is impossible for the naysayer. The more money he has, and above all, the more leisure, the more desperate is the impossibility to him. And this is also true of the man who refuses to approve of the fact of his own existence, having fallen into the mysterious, ineffable despair from weakness of which Soren Kierkegaard has spoken, and of which the old moral philosophy went by the name of acedia, slothfulness of the heart. It is a refusal regarding the very heart and fountainhead of existence itself, because of the despair of not willing to be oneself, which makes man unable to live with himself. He is driven out of his own house, into the hurly-burly of work and nothing else, into the fine-spun, exhausting game of sophistical phrasemongering, into incessant entertainment by empty stimulants. In short, into a no-man's land, which may be quite comfortably furnished, but which has no place for the serenity of intrinsically meaningful activity, for contemplation, and certainly not for festivity. The reason, no matter what, think about this, the martyr has nothing, and yet he possesses everything, like Paul says. On the other hand, the man who possesses everything, the things that he possesses only exacerbates his problem. They make him more miserable because his existence is fundamentally meaningless. Meaninglessness is at the core. Meaning is peripheral. For the martyr, meaning is central. Suffering is peripheral. And it's all because of how each one responds to the world that God has made. Whether it's recognized and rejoiced in that the world is good and has meaning, or whether that meaning is banished for the sake of freedom, so that we can impose our own meaning on it, so that we can be God in God's place. And this is why there is true freedom in the biblical view of creation that affirms there is meaning to the world long before I show up to appreciate it. This is one of my favorite things about creation. Man is not created until which day? Day 6, right? Well, that's because he is made in God. He's kind of the pinnacle of creation. But the flip side of it is that he wasn't there to watch God spread out the stars. He wasn't there to see God rejoice in the fish of the sea or the birds of the air. The dry land formed. He was there for none of it. It was all given to him as a gift, yes. But it was full of meaning long before he was there to enjoy it and appreciate it. I think this is why James, in another context, says, let every man be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. Why quick to hear? Because there's much to hear, much to contemplate, much to receive, because God has made the world jam-packed full of meaning. It's also why the foundation of biblical culture is affirmation. Affirmation is the heart of biblical culture. Isn't it interesting and significant that the word culture comes from Latin, as you know, and it means cultivation of the earth, literally cultivation of soil. That's what culture is. It's cultivating the earth that God has given. It's receiving and developing the world that He has already made and given that's full of meaning. It's being a steward of that. It points back to God's original commission to Adam in the garden. And that is to till and serve and guard the garden. What an interesting task Adam's given. Those are the commands that Adam's given. Your job is to till or to work and to serve the garden and to protect it. How can you serve something that doesn't have meaning? It's all predicated on the fact that God made a world full of meaning. And Adam's job was to search it out, to learn about it, to understand it, to protect it, to give his life for it so that it could be glorified. That's where culture making begins, by studying and serving and guarding what God has given. In the deepest sense, a cultured person is someone who knows and loves the good world God has made, and from that posture brings forth its potential, its ends that He instilled in it, and protects it from evil, from subversion, because that's what evil is. Evil is not a thing that God made. Evil is the distortion of the good things that God has made. It's always parasitic. This is, of course, Augustine, and you all know this from taking my class. But the reason why this is so important is because God never made evil into a thing. Things are not evil. This is what Paul says to Timothy. Certain people are forbidding foods and getting married. They forbid things that should be received with thankfulness because God made them all good. I once got in trouble at a sort of a Baptist conference when I said that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a good tree. And they're like, how do you, what? It's a good tree? No, it's a bad tree. It had to be a bad tree. I just think, no. Just stop and think about it for a few minutes. If it's a bad tree, the game's up. We might as well go home. God doesn't make anything bad. He's good. The only thing He can make, the only thing He will make, is something that reflects the goodness of His nature. And we, men and women, are made in that image. But all of creation is made to reflect that goodness. Evil is always parasitic. It must have good first before there is something to subvert. And when you understand that, it puts confidence into your heart, joy into your soul, because you know the goodness of the world, the battle for our culture, does not begin and end with us. Men and women cannot say you can be anything you want and get away with it. They're fighting against the world that they've been given. And that should elicit from us compassion, because when men and women think that they're free by saying that as a man, I'm a woman, or as a woman, I'm a man, you know the reality of what Paul says is that they've exchanged. They've exchanged the good of creation, the good that they've been given, and now they're living with a tragedy. Not something more, something much, much less. It's only men and women who have learned to love and delight in the world as it is given by God, and not for what it can be made to mean to them, who will have the courage to stand and to protect what they love when evil men try to take it away. I think in certain Christian circles, we have done ourselves a great disservice because we've tried to undermine that love, taken away the inheritance that God has given to us in a world that He is bent on redeeming. And because we've done that, we have undermined the very source of resistance against evil. We've turned the world over to a pack of trolls, and we've let them have it because we don't care. We don't love what God has given to us. And it's what we should defend and give our life for. Instilling this kind of love and the freedom it entails is the greatest purpose of education. So back to the onion. This is why the onion. One real thing is closer to God than all the diagrams of the world. Christians who love things for what they are, for what God made them to be, will be potent in the defense of those things. They will protect them. They will interpose their lives so that those things may be guarded and protected. And that's why I think ultimately, Chesterton said, the true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. My gastronomy class is dedicated to this reality, that teaching a love of the world that God is redeeming is essential to being good stewards of it, to being actually powerful cultural warriors, because we value the gift that God has given to us. It's also why I think, just offhand, why the wisdom literature is at the center of the Bible. Because you think about Solomon in the height of his glory. When it talks about that in Chronicles, Solomon's wisdom, guess what he was always talking about? Wisdom is not this ethereal spiritual reality. When he talked about wisdom, what Chronicles notes is that he talked about birds and trees and flowers, the hyssop that grows on the wall. He had insight into the world. That's why men and women from everywhere flocked to hear the wisdom of Solomon. It's because Solomon understood the meaning that God had put into the things that he had made. He saw it and he valued it. Remember, things are precious before they are contributory. I hope that if you have not had a chance to take my gastronomy class, I hope one of these days to offer gastronomy to just as a class for alumni to come and take. But the thing that animates it is this. if we love onions, truly, we will also love children. We will also love marriages. We will love being a man and being a woman. We will love creativity. We will love the study of the world. The deeper we go, the more glory we see of God and of what He's given us. So it creates gusto and zeal in the hearts of God's people to create cultures that are rich and vibrant and full of life. This is why Bach wrote at the top of his scores, to the glory of God alone. Not because he was dedicating it to the glory of God. He was writing it because he arranged the notes so that they manifested the glory of God. Because he believed the world was full of God's glory. All right. Thank you very much for listening patiently and being attentive. I think that there is, I understand, are we supposed to have a time of questions and answers? Yep. Is there any questions you have over anything that I've said, anything you'd like to ask, that I take a hand at answering for you? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could define affirmation the way the world defines it as opposed to the way you're using it so we can distinguish between them.
Right. That's great. So the way I'm referring to it has it presupposes a biblical metaphysic underneath it, right? So affirming a thing, studying an onion, for instance. When Capon says, so she's asking, what's the difference between a biblical view of affirmation and the way that our culture might use the word to affirm? We actually hear that word a lot in our culture, right? So it's a really great question. The biblical perspective assumes that the thing has meaning that is apart from you. So things have telos, things have a purpose or a goal. And in the older view, man's purpose or his job in the world was not to just go out and decide whatever it was that he wanted the world to be and then go out and pursue that. But it was to understand his place in the world, to understand the meaning of the world, and to understand the purpose of the things that are in the world, and then to find his place in that world and to pursue it. And so it meant fundamentally honoring the integrity of the world that existed and the purpose of the one who made it. So when Adam named the animals, for instance, he didn't just decide, I have cool names and I'm just going to stick them on these animals, kind of the way that movie stars name babies. That's not the way that Adam named the animals. The Hebrew notion of naming was to affix something that gained insight into the thing named. So it was an appraisal of it. It was an assessment of it and saying, this is what it is, this is what its purpose is for. That's what the name is. And I love the fact that in Genesis says that God was there seeking to listen and hear what names Adam gave to things. He wanted to see what man would make of the things that he had made. That's what affirmation is. It's that affirming of the fact that an onion, in Capon's sense, the reason I'm having a confrontation with an onion is because an onion has a being that's not me. And its meaning is not dependent on me. That's one of the things that we should say hallelujah to our doctrine of creation, is that the world does not depend on me for meaning. It's there. And my job is to understand it for what it is. So that's, of course, why a real thing is closer to God than all the diagrams of the world. The real thing is what He made. It bears the meaning that He gave it. I can do nothing about that. I can either acknowledge it or I can tell lies about it. But I can do nothing about it because I didn't create it. Okay? Now, affirmation in the worldly sense is completely the opposite. It's the sense that things do not have meaning apart from the knower, the one who says, this is what something means. There's no design in the world. And of course, by cutting the world away from God, severing that tether, it means that I am free to do what I want to do. So in the modern sense, the modern notion of freedom is that I can do whatever it is that I want to do, whatever my desires tell me to do or what I want to. No one stands in the way of my desires. And we're not talking just Christian view, but Aristotle, Plato, the whole Western tradition would have laughed at that view as completely nonsensical. Freedom is doing what I ought to do, what I was made to do, what my purpose is. It's finding my purpose. So affirmation in this sense is completely arbitrary and it's completely open, but the cost of it is that meaning has been completely taken away. Does that make sense?
Amen.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? Anything else? Yes?
It seems to me that when you cultivate this kind of culture, maybe in your family or even more broadly in a nation, because culture is such a strong thing to kind of train loyalties and keep people in a certain lifestyle, you can have people continuing to live out a certain culture after the meaning behind it has fallen away.
Yes.
So like,
Right.
British culture, not very Christian anymore, but they still love Christmas just as much as they ever did.
Right.
Or churches with high liturgy, you'll find people going through the motions for a lot longer after they stop believing than another type of church. So what's a way that maybe as a family, if you're training your children to love creation,
Right.
that you can keep them from drifting?
Yes. So it's interesting that Jesus says that it's not what goes into a man that defiles a man, but it's what comes out of a man that defiles a man, right? Again, I love that because there's nothing in the world that's evil. You have to understand what that means, of course. It's not to say that there isn't evil in the world. It's simply to say nothing that God made is evil. We tend to do that. We tend to locate evil in things. Do not taste, do not touch, do not handle. Okay? But how do we then? The world is our friend, our dearest friend next to God, because he made it for us. So how do we guard our hearts? Well, we guard our hearts by loving God, the giver of those gifts. And I think that at the heart of it is what Romans 1 says, the world that is not believing, what they do not do, what they refuse to do, which is to give thanks and to be generous and give. To rejoice, give thanks, and be generous and give. So, for instance, joy. Joy, Paul tells us we're to have in all circumstances, to give thanks constantly, to rejoice in the midst of all kinds of circumstances. But instead, what we do is we grumble and complain and think that the Lord owes us something, like Israel did in the wilderness. God owes us food. God doesn't owe us anything. He gives us great and gracious gifts, and our job is to cultivate attitudes that thank Him for those gifts, that are constantly receiving and rejoicing and thanking. And then, when God takes them away from us, and that's the real test, is when He takes them away. Do our hearts revolt in bitterness against Him? Or do we say, Lord, this hurts, like Jesus did in the garden. Let this cup pass away from me, but not my will be done, but thine. Why thine? Because your will is good. It's like the things you made. It's good. So I think that one of the central things that we have to do in this is to cultivate gratitude and thanksgiving. It's not to hold things at arm's length, which is often the way that we think we're protecting ourselves. Not at all. No. What we have to do, though, is to guard our hearts and make sure that we are, in fact, thankful to the one who's given. And part of that is because of our life. In some sense, our life is a continual loss. It's true that we're dying and that we will live again. But in the process of dying, we have to give things up. We have to let things go. And that's what trains our heart, I think, to see whether or not we've learned this lesson, whether we truly love the thing that we let go of. Because idolatry doesn't love the thing. It doesn't receive it as a gift, and it won't let go of it. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Can you elaborate further on how food is an opportunity, food specifically is an opportunity to love the world as it is,
Yes.
rather than what we make it to be, in a way that's distinct from other areas, from whether it's human companionship or something. Obviously, it's
Right.
one of the five senses, but is it deeper than that?
Well, it is, and I think there's some at some level what I've talked about here. You could almost talk about anything in creation this way, right? But I think one of the things that God tells us, I mean, you have to take my class. Because one of the things that we go is walk through the place of food in the Bible from beginning to end. And when you understand what food is in the biblical narrative, so much of what eating is about is acknowledging our dependence on God, that we do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. But it is also taste and see how gracious the Lord is. So one of the quotes that Capon says is that creation's purpose is to furnish our sensibilities against the day when we will sit down at the heavenly banquet and see how gracious the Lord is. Nourishment is necessary only for a while. What we will need forever is taste. Let me be provocative for a moment. I think because the image of banquet is at the beginning of the Bible, right? Creation fell in a meal. It's redeemed in a meal, and it's consummated in a meal. And that consummation of the meal, of eating and drinking and feasting, festal day in God's presence, in which we see him face to face and his name is written on our foreheads. His presence is among us. That day, Corinthians says he will reveal new dimensions of his love to us, right? Taste is fundamentally going to be necessary for that, because as creatures, we're not like our Creator. We're not infinite. We're finite. And that means that he will be able to continually, forever and ever, reveal new facets, new dimensions. If you've ever tasted a great wine, you know what this is about. Because great wines have the capacity to reveal things as time goes on. As the evening progresses and the wine opens up, you taste more and more realities. And you think, wow, I didn't know bacon fat could be in wine. And there it is, right? And then it gives way to currants. And it gives way to olives and even wet stones, graphite, like you're sucking on a pencil as a boy. I used to love to suck on pencils. And I love graphite in wine, particularly in Cabernets from California, right? But that develops. And part of what I tell my students in gastronomy is one of the reasons you're taking this class is because I'm doing my part as a teacher so that you know when you're in the presence of greatness. There's nothing more tragic in my estimation than someone who doesn't know when they're in the presence of greatness. They don't have the capacity to taste it. And when we taste, I say taste this way, I'm not talking about just put things on your tongue, but it's judgment. Fundamentally, taste is a form of judgment. To know how gracious the Lord is. Good question. Any other questions? We're almost out of time here.
Nobody on Zoom has questions.
Nobody on Zoom has questions. All right. Well, thank you all for giving up an evening to come out here and listen. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.